Part 2, Chapter 22 of The Story of the Barbary Corsairs by Stanley Lane-Poole. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James K. White. Chapter 22, The French in America, 1830 to 1881. The successes of the English and American fleets had produced their effects, not so much in arresting the course of piracy, as in encouraging the European states to defy the pirates. The coup de grace was administered by France, the vis-à-vis, the natural opponent of the Algerine Corsairs, and perhaps the chief sufferer by their attacks. A dispute in April 1827 between the French consul and the Dey, in which the former forgot the decencies of diplomatic language, and the latter lost his temper and struck the offender with the handle of his fan, led to an ineffectual blockade of Algiers by a French squadron for 2 years, during which the Algerines aggravated the breach by several acts of barbarity displayed towards French prisoners. Matters grew to a crisis. In August 1829, the Dey dismissed a French envoy and fired upon his ship as he was retiring under a flag of truce, and it became evident that war on a decisive scale was now inevitable. Accordingly, on May 26, 1830, a large fleet sailed out of Toulon. Admiral Duperrey commanded, and the land forces on board numbered 37,000 foot, besides cavalry and artillery. Delayed by stress of weather, the fleet was not sighted off Algiers till June 13th, when it anchored in the bay of Sidi Ferrouge, and there landed next day with little opposition, and began to throw up entrenchments. A force of Arabs and Kabyles were severely defeated on the 19th, with the loss of their camp and provisions, and the French slowly pushed their way towards the city, beating back the Algerines as they advanced. The defenders fought game to the last, but the odds were overwhelming, and the only wonder is that so overpowering a force of besiegers, both by sea and land, should have evinced so much caution and diffidence of their own immense superiority. On July 4th, the actual bombardment of the city began. The Fort de l'Empereur was taken after the Algerines had blown up the powder magazine, and the Dey asked for terms of surrender. Safety of person and property for himself and for the inhabitants of the city was promised by the French commander, and on this condition the enemy occupied Algiers on the following day, July 5th. A week later the Dey, with his family and attendants and belongings, sailed for Naples in a French frigate, and Algiers had seen the last of its Mohammedan rulers. Here, so far as Algiers is concerned, the story of the Corsairs properly ends, but a glance at the events which have occurred during the French occupation may usefully supplement what has already been recorded. The conquest had been marked by a moderation and humanity which did infinite honor to the French arms. It would have been well if a similar policy had distinguished their subsequent proceedings. It was not necessary to dwell upon the assurance given by France to Great Britain that the occupation was only temporary, upon the latter announcement of permanent annexation, or upon England's acquiescence in the perfidy, upon the French engaging never to push their conquests further to the east or west of Algiers, an engagement curiously illustrated by the recent occupation of Tunis. But if the aggrandizement of France in North Africa is matter for regret, infinitely more to be deplored is the manner in which the possession of the interior of the country has been effected. It is not too much to say that from the moment when the French, having merely taken the city of Algiers, began the work of subduing the tribes of the interior in 1830, to the day when they at last set up civil instead of military government, after the lessons of the Franco-German War in 1870, the history of Algiers is one long record of stupidly brutal camp rule, repudiation of sacred engagements, inhuman massacres of unoffending natives of both sexes and all ages, violence without judgment, and severity without reason. One French general after another was sent out to bring the rebellious Arabs and Kabyles into subjection, only to display his own incompetence for the inhuman task, and to return baffled and brutalized by the disgraceful work he thought himself bound to carry out. There is no more humiliating record in the annals of annexation than this miserable conquest of Algiers. It is the old story of trying to govern what the conquerors attempting to understand the people first. Temper, justice, insight, and conciliation would have done more in 4 years than martial intolerance and drum tyranny accomplished in 40. In all these years of miserable guerrilla warfare, in which such well-known commanders as Bugeaud, Pélissier, Canrobert, Saint Arnaud, MacMahon, and many more, learned their first demoralizing lessons in warfare, the only people who excite our interest and admiration are the Arab tribes. That they were unwise in resisting the inevitable is indisputable, but it is no less certain that they resisted with splendid valor and indomitable perseverance. Again and again they defeated the superior forces of France in the open field, wrested strong cities from the enemy, and even threatened to extinguish the authority of the alien in Algiers forever, for all which the invaders had only to thank themselves. Had General Clausel, the first military governor of Algiers, been a wise man, the people might have accepted by degrees the sovereignty of France. But the violence of his measures and his ignorance of the very word conciliation raised up such strenuous opposition, engendered such terrible reprisals, and set the two parties so hopelessly against each other, that nothing less than a prolonged struggle could be expected. The hero of this sanguinary conflict was Abd-el-Kādir, a man who united in his person and character all the virtues of the old Arabs with many of the best results of civilization. Descended from a saintly family, himself learned and devout, a Hajj or Meccan pilgrim, frank, generous, hospitable, and withal a splendid horseman, redoubtable in battle, and fired with the patriotic enthusiasm which belongs to a born leader of men, Abd-el-Kādir became the recognized chief of the Arab insurgents. The Dey of Algiers had foreseen danger in the youth, who was forced to fly to Egypt in fear of his life. When he returned a young man of 24, he found his country in the hands of the French, and his people driven to desperation. His former fame and his father's name were talismans to draw the impetuous tribes towards him, and he soon had so large a following that the French deemed it prudent for the moment to recognize him, 1834, as Emir of Mascata, his native place, of which he had already been chosen king by general acclamation. Here he prepared for the coming struggle, and when the French discovered a pretext for attacking him in 1835, they were utterly routed on the river Masca. The fortunes of war vacillated in the following year, till in May 1837 Abd-el-Kādir triumphantly defeated a French army in the plain of the Metija. A fresh expedition of 20,000 met with no better success, for Arabs and Berbers are hard to trap, and Abd-el-Kādir, whose strategy evoked the admiration of the Duke of Wellington, was for a time able to baffle all the marshals of France. The whole country, save a few fortified posts, was now under his sway, and the French at last perceived that they had to deal with a pressing danger. They sent out 80,000 men under Marshal Bugeaud, and the success of this officer's method of sweeping the country with movable columns was soon apparent. Town after town fell, tribe after tribe made terms. Even Abd-el-Kādir's capital, Taqidemt, was destroyed. Mascata was subdued, 1841, and the heroic chief, still repudiating defeat, retreated to Morocco. Twice he led fresh armies into his own land, in 1843 and 1844. The one succumbed to the Duc d'Aumale, the other to Bugeaud. Pélissier covered himself with peculiar glory by smoking 500 men, women, and children to death in a cave. At last, seeing the hopelessness of further efforts and the misery they brought upon his people, Abd-el-Kādir accepted terms 1847, and surrendered to the Duc d'Aumale on condition of being allowed to retire to Alexandria or Naples. It is needless to add that, in accordance with Algerian precedent, the terms of surrender were subsequently repudiated, though not by the royal duke, and the noble Arab was consigned for 5 years to a French prison. Louis Napoleon eventually allowed him to depart to Broussa, and he finally died at Damascus in 1883, not, however, before he had rendered signal service to his former enemies by protecting the Christians during the massacres of 1860. Though Abdel-Kadir had gone, peace did not settle upon Algeria. Again and again the tribes revolted, only to feel once more the merciless severity of their military rulers. French colonists did not readily adopt the new field for immigration. It seemed as though the best thing would be to withdraw from a bootless, expensive, and troublesome venture. Louis Napoleon, however, when he visited Algiers in 1865, contrived somewhat to reassure the Kabyles, while he guaranteed their undisturbed possession of their territories, and until his fall there was peace. But the day of weakness for France was the opportunity for Algiers, and another serious revolt broke out. The Kabyles descended from their mountains, and General Duroc had enough to do to hold them in check. The result of this last attempt, and the change of government in France, was the appointment of civil instead of military governors, and since then Algeria has on the whole remained tranquil, though it takes an army of 50,000 men to keep it so. There are, at least, no more Algerine Corsairs. It remains to refer to the affairs of Tunis. If there was provocation for the French occupation of Algiers in 1830, there was none for that of Tunis in 1881. It was a pure piece of aggression, stimulated by the rival efforts of Italy, and encouraged by the timidity of the English Foreign Office, then under the guidance of Lord Granville. A series of diplomatic grievances based upon no valid grounds was set up by the ingenious representative of France in the Regency, M. Theodore Roustan, since deservedly exposed, and the resistance of the unfortunate Bey, Mohammed Sadiq, to demands which were in themselves preposterous, and which obviously menaced his semi-independence as a viceroy of the Ottoman Empire, received no support from any of the powers, save Turkey, who was then depressed in influence and resources by the adversities of the Russian invasion. The result was natural. A strong power, unchecked by efficient rivals, pursued her stealthy policy of aggression against a very weak but not dishonest state, and finally seized upon the ridiculous pretext of some disturbances among the tribes bordering on Algeria to invade the territory of the Bey. In vain Mohammed Sadiq assured M. Roustan that order had been restored among the tribes. In vain he appealed to all the powers, and above all to England. Lord Granville believed the French government when it solemnly assured him that the operations about to commence on the borderland between Algeria and Tunis are meant solely to put an end to the constant inroads of the frontier clans into Algerian territory, and that the independence of the Bey and the integrity of his territory are in no way threatened. It was Algiers over again, but with even more serious consequences to English influence, indeed to all but French influence, in the Mediterranean. Perfide Albion wholly confided in perfida Gallia, and it was too late to protest against the flagrant breach of faith when the French army had taken Kef and Tabarka, April 26, 1881, when the tricolour was floating over Bizerta, and when General Briard, with every circumstance of insolent brutality, had forced the treaty of Qasr es-Sa'id upon the luckless Bey under the muzzles of the guns of the Republic, May 12th. It is difficult to believe that the feeling of the English statesmen of the day is expressed in the words, Aecolem meminisse juvabit. The Bey had been captured. He, and since his death, Sidi Ali Bey, have continued to be the figureheads of the French protectorate, but his people were not so easily subdued. The southern provinces of Tunis broke into open revolt, and for a time there ensued a period of hopeless anarchy, which the French authorities made no effort to control. At last they bestirred themselves, and to some purpose. Sfax was mercilessly bombarded and sacked. Houses were blown up with their inhabitants inside them, and a positive reign of terror was inaugurated, in which mutual reprisals, massacres, and executions heightened the horrors of war. The whole country outside the fortified posts became the theatre of bloodshed, robbery, and anarchy. It was the history of Algiers in petto. Things have slowly improved since then, especially since M. Roustan's recall. Doubtless, in time Tunis will be as subdued and as docile as Algiers, and meanwhile France is developing the resources of the land and opening out one of the finest harbors in existence. Yet Monsieur Henri de Rochefort did not, perhaps, exaggerate when he wrote, "We compared the Tunisian expedition to an ordinary fraud. We were mistaken. The Tunis business is a robbery aggravated by murder." The Algerian business was of a similar character. "Qui commence bien finit bien," assumes Admiral Julien de la Gravière in his chapter entitled Gallia Victrix. If the history of France in Africa ends in bringing the southern borderlands of the Mediterranean, the old haunts of the Barbary Corsairs, within the pale of civilization, it may some day be possible to bury the unhappy past, and inscribe upon the tombstone the optimistic motto, Finis coronat opus. End of Part 2, Chapter 22. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of the story of the Barbary Corsairs by Stanley Lane-Poole.